Today is Friday, February 9th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here, as always, with my broadcast partner, co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are we doing?
I am doing wonderfully. Mr. Robinson, thank you for asking.
Well, for our audience, you know that Mr. Smith is serious about this podcast when he starts rolling up his sleeves, as he is right now.
I roll up my sleeves pretty much every day, winter, summer. I don't know why. I just have to do it.
It's actually quite remarkable because what it appears to happen is you get dressed for work like a normal person. You drive in, you get into your office, and the first thing you do is roll up your sleeves and loosen your tie.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. We're doing a podcast here.
We are.
What is our podcast this afternoon? Technically this morning, still late morning. What is our podcast?
Our podcast is this. Life throws at all of us, especially when we're young and we're doing new things and different things and going different places. Life throws at us a whole lot of people. And sometimes people are fun to hang around. Sometimes people we enjoy spending time with. But the Bible emphasizes we need to be careful about the friends we choose. And so for today's podcast, we want to talk about things to keep in mind as you choose your friends wisely.
That is wisdom. Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Jake and Julia, and welcome again to the Living Youth Podcast. And I'm excited to talk about this particular topic, and I have the joy of talking about the challenge of choosing your friends wisely while sitting at a table with a good friend that I feel I have chosen wisely. I hope he feels he has chosen wisely. I don't want to put you on the spot, Mr. Robinson, but
it's too early to tell. I was kidding. I am totally kidding. No, absolutely. I genuinely feel blessed to not only have gotten to work with you, but honestly, truly a friendship and again, a chance. I mean, we bounce stuff off each other all the time. That's like in a way you only would with somebody you've developed a real rapport and a deep level of trust with.
You know, that's the only reason I brought that up was fishing for compliments. But thank you, because I feel exactly the same way. And I think that aspect of serving as a sounding board may come up in one of the points later. But I do want to say here at the very beginning, part of what's interesting about life, and I wouldn't change this, is life does throw at us a lot of random people. And I don't mean people inherently random in and of themselves. I mean that, you know, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, you know, the life throws at you a lot of different kinds of people that you encounter in a variety of different circumstances. All the more when you're young and maybe you're joining the local YMCA soccer team, or you're in classes with people that you didn't select all those other students, you know, to be in the class with you. So you have a real, I don't know why I'm stuck on the word potpourri this week, Mr. Robinson, but a real potpourri of people, kind of a medley of different kinds of people. And you didn't pick all the people you encounter. You don't get to pick the person behind the counter at the bank or behind the counter at the, you know, Subway sandwich place you go to buy something to eat. But that's what you're given. But not all of those people are going to be close friends. And so that it takes wisdom. And I look at my life, and, you know, if I go back to our more, I say humble beginnings, hopefully our middles are also humble and our ends are humble. But if I go back, you know, I was a high school teacher way back when. You were a print professional and graphics professional way back when. I look at, say, Mr. DeSimone, whom I spend a lot of time with. He's my son's father-in-law and also a good friend. Old HVAC guy. You go way back when. My wife even was a homeschooled baker, you know, was very good at what she did in that regard. And in a lot of ways, it's not like if you'd asked me, hey, you know, who do you think would be your closest friends and associates, you know, at a certain age? And I certainly would have thought of people with those backgrounds. And the church has a wonderful way of mixing us up from different regions of the country. In the ministry, you encounter people you've never met before, that you wouldn't have normally met. And a camp does that with kids, brings kids from all over the country together. And so you get this wide variety of people, which is fantastic. But at the same time, we do need to be choosy about that. That is, in terms of who we actually invest in a relationship with, we can't just allow ourselves to be thrown together and then build these kind of deeper relationships, these relationships that have a profound quality to them, where they will be requiring a large amount of investment from us and that we'll be depending on them in very particular ways. That can't just be anybody, because we've said before, your future spouse will impact your life, both not just physically, but spiritually. Everything about your life will be impacted by that future spouse. And that has to be taken seriously. But it's not just your future spouse. It's also the friends, the company you keep, the people that you voluntarily choose to spend time with. They also will have an impact on you. And it can be a very positive impact, but it also can be a tremendously negative impact. And I want to key off before we kind of launch into some of these points about that with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33. Where in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 33, Paul says very plainly, "Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits." And it's not just the advice he gives, evil company corrupts good habits, but it's the way he prefaces it. Do not be deceived about this, because how many of us as adults in our younger days might have had a friend that maybe wasn't the best person that should be in our life, but we enjoy being around them, and in general, we think, and we're spending time with them, and we just like the guy or the gal, whatever. But in the end, we look on their influence in our life, and it's not a good influence. And it's so easy for our deceptive Jeremiah 17:9 hearts to give us all these reasons why this person should be our friend, and it's just fine. And Paul is saying, man, do not deceive yourself. Evil company corrupts good habits. The people around you will have an influence on you. You cannot avoid it. You must be mindful of that.
I can't remember where I heard this. It probably came off the internet, but it's possible it was like a radio program or a podcast. And I do not know where it came from, how long ago I heard it, but it really resonated with me. And if this is not technically precisely right, I think the sense of it is good, which is you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Oh, that's a neat way to put that.
And when I remember the first time I heard that, what's the first thing I did? I was like, who are the 5 people I spend the most time with? Okay. And this doesn't mean that you don't have your own personality and your own will, and you kind of take these other people and factor them in. But it really resonated with me as having a real truth to it. And every so often in my life, that would come to mind, and I would reevaluate those who are with me. Now, as I'm older and worked here for the church for more than 10 years, you're in the same place for a while, like the people you're around tend to be constant.
Right.
At my old print job, so the job I was in before this one, I was there for 12 years. And it's funny, your introductory comments made me think about that time a little bit. And our company was never really large, and the front office group was never more than 10 or 15 people, 10 people. And in general, there's 5 or 6 or 7 managers that kind of ran the place. I was one of them. And people would come and go. There were some people that were thorny and prickly, and you had to manage in a certain way. I don't mean like literally manage them. It's just in your interpersonal relationship.
You had to keep in mind how to work with them, right?
But man, some of them were wonderful, and I liked working with them. And we were a tight group. And I remember somebody else telling me one time that somebody else had come in and wasn't fitting in, where they felt like they weren't fitting in very well. And somebody told them, it was like, well, you've come into an organization that's a very tight group that really likes each other and works well together. And I actually appreciated that sentiment.
That input.
Yeah. And there was one time I'll never forget. I was sitting there in our managers meeting, and I know this kind of gets off topic slightly, thinking how much I actually like the majority of my coworkers, and I enjoyed being with them, and I couldn't wait until they eventually encountered the truth.
Yeah.
And then like you start thinking like long-term things like, well, why have we each individually had the experiences in life we've had? Like, why did I have a 12-year experience at Horizon Printing? Well, a lot of that, frankly, was to prep me for what I'm doing now. Like, it's all that, everything I ever did at that company, I use now here working for the church. But also these people that you spent years with, some of them working very closely. And so the very optimistic side of me, the Pollyanna side of me is like, maybe we'll work together in the future. They'll be on I don't know how God will organize it, but I always tend to think in terms of teams. And, here's a group that you work with, that made me happy to think about those people coming in. But kind of back to my original thought, if you're married, one of the 5 people you spend the most time with that's going to influence you is going to be your spouse.
Oh, wow. That's a weighted average, I think we would say in
Yeah.
math. Yeah, that person's probably going to have a large influence, but yeah, absolutely.
And here at work, obviously you and a couple other people here, and then maybe you have, external friends. And anyway, it was an interesting, I would actually recommend everybody to think about the 5 people that they're around the most. Maybe even there's a toxic coworker you don't like, but you have no choice. And figure out how that averages out into your life and how it affects you.
Wow. I'm so glad you mentioned workers, say, outside of the church. When I was an actuary, which is what I was in between being a high school teacher and working here for the church, my boss, I had such a good relationship with her, this French-Canadian gal. She and her husband, too, he used to like to ask religious questions. I always enjoyed that because I may not have been a minister yet, but I love feeling like I'm on the front line, of answering questions.
You've mentioned her a number of times very fondly.
Oh, yeah, because I was actually planning on writing her and her husband again sometime. I try to write her every few years or so just to kind of touch base, see how their kids are doing, kind of give them an update. And she knows Janine, my wife. And just kind of, again, just to keep up. Because I remember once when I was there, we had a coworker who left, and we enjoyed working with them. And then after they left, I don't think we really ever did hear from them again. And yet, part of why I am stirred, I think, is because she was a very good influence. And she is, even now, in terms of things I do from a managerial perspective, say here in the editorial department, she set a great example for her. I don't know that I meet her example, but she cared for her staff, the people that worked with her. She had a level of organization that I clearly did not have at the time. I was really trying to learn. And the fact is, because definitely at the office, that we had to work together a lot because she was my boss. And in that, she made an impact. I ended up being affected, and that could have been negative or positive. I'm grateful that she was a very positive, competent boss who did a good job. So what we want to talk about today, and bosses are not exactly in the category that we're talking about, because a lot of people can't choose their boss. And if it's a toxic enough environment, it's not a matter of saying, I'm going to spend more time with boss Larry instead of boss Sally. That might involve having to change jobs, which sometimes that can be enough to cause you to want to change jobs. Rather, we're going to talk about those where we definitely have more flexibility. Those are people that are the friends, the people you are voluntarily spending a lot of time with and wanting to spend time with when you're thinking of things you can do, whether it's play a game or go see a ball game or something like that. And we want to talk about some biblical principles because, you teens and young adults, we're all about biblical thinking. That's what we're trying to model here.
I would argue if we sound wise at all,
only because of that.
It's only because of that.
That's right. So we're going to hit maybe some key verses, some principles, at least. And this is not to be the definitive list. We've talked about friendship before. We noticed an old blog that talked about how to be a good friend. And here it's a little bit of a different angle. For sure. So one of the ones I want to bring up, and it might seem like a weird one, but it's in Exodus chapter 33. And I say weird. It doesn't have to be weird, but I think it's a little strange to pull up for the reason that might become obvious. In Exodus 33, we're talking about God and Moses being friends. Because there's a certain aspect I want to bring out that what we now know, this is actually the being who became Jesus Christ, who is actually speaking in Exodus 33. And it says in Exodus 33 and verse 11, it says, "So the Eternal spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend." Now we do know, like when Moses asked to see the glory of God, he didn't let him just see the full force of his face. He had to see his back. It's what he's trying to talk about here is that they had an access and conversation. They actually spoke in this sense face to face. But the idea that God highlights that kind of conversation, it was the way a man speaks to his friend. It wasn't through, like in a business, just memos, you send a memo. What God did with other prophets and such, he might speak to them in dreams.
So you've naturally triggered where this actually kind of some payoff is the right way. You almost wonder if this is even foreshadowing, but no. In Numbers 12, when Miriam and Aaron challenge him, God makes exactly the point that
That's exactly right. He's saying, "Look, you guys think you're like Moses? You think that you guys are in the same spot? I deal with him face to face like a friend. I don't talk to him through dreams and such." And so this sense that why would God say like a man speaks to his friend? Because when you are choosing who, because we do need, like we mentioned, you need to be a certain kind of picky, not so picky that you're holding people to a certain kind of what's
narrow, unrealistic standard.
We're not talking about being narrow, because you're going to find people that make good friends, as we'll talk about later, who disagree with you on some things. But when it comes to trying to decide, well, who do I really want as a friend? What am I looking for in a good friend? It needs to be someone you can actually talk with, someone that you can have a face-to-face conversation with. You know, we all have quote-unquote friends on Facebook, and it's terrible in a certain way that Facebook has kind of co-opted that word friend, because online conversations like that, they can feel deep, and maybe sometimes there are, but generally almost all of that is so shallow. And I don't mean shallow because the topics are shallow. I mean the actual depth of like you might be talking about big topics, and that's great. I'm not saying don't, but still it's a relationship that demands little of you, right? You kind of come and go in the conversation as long as you want to type. You say you like something by clicking a little button. When it comes to an actual friend in the sort of biblical sense God is talking about, that's someone you can actually look eye to eye with and actually be able to have a conversation. Yeah. And as Mr. Robinson alluded to it earlier in his earlier comments, I know one of the things I appreciate about Mr. Robinson is that even when I don't know what he might say, sometimes I just need to talk through something. I'm kind of a talk it through kind of guy, even if I'm talking to myself. But when I talk to myself, I don't get that extra additional sort of, feedback I want. And sometimes I'm just wanting to explore something I think is profound, and how much I appreciate Mr. Robinson. Good example, my wife, we're in a car, and to be able to actually explore this idea with someone, it's priceless.
Well, and not to give myself credit for this, because I've seen this discussed in other realms, like ideas need careful midwives.
Oh, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's, if it's not Brene Brown, it's somebody like her, and that is, you need this, like the way you think through your ideas. You need just exactly as you described. And so you need, we're going to use safe space here. You need a safe space to talk about it and not feel like your idea is going to be criticized or ridiculed, and have a chance to just think through it and process through it. And you're not even invested in everything. And maybe even you think, well, this is a stupid idea, whatever, but you're working through it. And so thankfully I had some positive reinforcement on it, but I realized part of my benefit to you in that way was giving you some space to explore it, not jumping in on, well, that's not a good idea because, what are you thinking here or whatever.
Yeah, I do appreciate it. You're a wonderful sounding board in that sense. And that's what we're talking about too, is if you examine your relationships with some, there's nothing wrong with people you just, you're having fun with on your team or whatever you might be doing. But don't confuse those with the kind of friendships we're talking about here, because we're going to talk about friendships where there's a certain amount of, there might even be dependencies where you need to be able to depend on someone. There's certain levels of trust. And sometimes when people confuse having good times with others, like, oh, these people are my friends. Well, it depends on what you mean. We're kind of talking about relationships of some kind of depth.
Well, I appreciate you're mentioning of Facebook. Now, I have never been on Facebook. I'm not even listing that like that's some kind of virtue. It's just, my point is I don't have experience with it, but how can you not know about Facebook? And
right.
I was talking to somebody years ago, and he was acknowledging to me that he'd taken some heat for some of the things he'd put out there, like
on Facebook.
Some of his Facebook comments and stuff. And so I was just trying to explore it with him, and I was like, well, why are you posting something like that? And he said, I just want to have a conversation. And I did actually say this to him, but that's not a conversation. Putting out a story or a topic or your idea, and then 500 people comment on it, and it actually more often than not will devolve into an argument. Like, a conversation, a real conversation, is with a small, limited group of people or a good friend. You may think you're having I don't want to completely dismiss it. I know there are like Twitter threads and stuff where people kind of go through and things.
You're not saying it doesn't potentially have value, but don't confuse that for what you do actually with a friend, and especially if someone is looking for conversation. And if they're going to Facebook and it doesn't satisfy, that could be part of why. You're not actually investing in a Mr. McNair, Rod McNair, had an article some time ago called FaceTime, trying to talk to families and youth about seeking that actual, not with a screen, not something else, but actual face-to-face time. And to a certain extent, Facebook and social media can give us the illusion of that, but if it leaves us fundamentally unsatisfied, it's because it is fundamentally unsatisfying when you're looking for that kind of interaction.
Maybe what thinking about it, maybe I'm not using quite the right words. Like, you can have a forum discussion. You can have a discussion with larger groups of people.
It's like a forum. That's a good word. Yeah.
But it's not the same as like a real human being conversation. That is a different, more intimate thing.
Yes. Facebook, I've tried to say, is if you're going to say something on Facebook, consider it as standing on a street corner with a bullhorn, and just kind of blaring it to a large crowd. And whether it's a large crowd of people that you've handpicked because it's some kind of private post, but it's not the same thing as just a one-on-one kind of conversation.
Well, see, that reminds me of self-plug here. The article I wrote on the social media, the personalities of people you'll find online when you're in discussion with social media. So, for example, the original question was, well, with all these things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, where we can reach a wider audience and talk to people, we have this technology at our disposal, was the Bible still relevant? And I realized, in my opinion, that it was more relevant than ever, because the same personalities are still out there. If you have somebody who's prone to gossiping, or there's a particular category the Bible calls the talebearer, you've taken... So if we, even 100 and something years ago, the United States was 90% rural and 10% of the people were in the cities, and we've switched. But a gossip in a small town could cause a lot of damage. But just imagine a gossip who has access to instantly a wide audience. You go on Facebook and instantly spread some new rumor, and has a far greater reach. It magnifies everything in a way that potentially makes everything a lot worse.
And it would actually make it that much more attractive a medium to someone who's looking to do that. Well, help me remember that one. That was the article. You wrote that article about, I can't remember the title. It was like 5 people you'll meet online. It's got to be close to 5
years ago.
Oh, yeah, it was some time ago. We'll do our best to add that one.
I wish it was called that. I think it's more mundane.
I'll try to add a note about it. It was in the Living Church News. Okay, so what you're trying to decide on, you're trying to choose your friends. You want someone you can actually have conversation with, you can actually talk with. Also, I wanted to look at Deuteronomy 13:6. This one's going to sound kind of brutal. Keep in mind, we're not Old Covenant. We're not going to be stoning anybody to death. Please keep that in mind. But in Deuteronomy chapter 13, it actually starts with, I think, a really beautiful phrase. It's talking about friends. And I think it's highlighting how you feel about friends. In Deuteronomy chapter 13, we'll start in verse 6. It says here, if your brother, the son of your mother, your own son or your daughter, the wife of your bosom, or your friend who is as your own soul. Let me pause there just as a writer. And so what a beautiful, phrase, right? I mean, it is. And I think it's important that it's saying this in Deuteronomy, because he's trying to acknowledge you're talking about someone who feels like it's like you share a soul on, like I say a soulmate, but it's just talking about a friend. This is someone you feel like you're that close to, because he's having to emphasize that for the sake of this. So imagine someone you feel incredibly close to. And then he launches into this. If any of those people, including the friend who's as your own soul, secretly entices you, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known, neither you nor your fathers, of the gods of the peoples, which are all around you, near to you, or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth. There's nothing he likes that's this other gods. In verse 8, he says, you shall not consent to him or listen to him, nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare him or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Now, he's not talking about we just grab a knife, better kill that guy. He's talking about this is in the Old Covenant
We
context.
hope it doesn't come to that.
Yeah. So in the Old Covenant context, he's saying your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So in other words, this guy is going to get stoned to death. In the old covenant and how they handled those things, because such individuals were corrupters who would destroy the entire nation. So,
that you as a good friend, correct me if my recollection's off. Okay, I would argue that exact scenario is played out in a hymn that we sing.
Oh, okay.
Is it? But as for me, I'll call on God. And we talk about we used to walk together in counsel blended sweet.
You know what? One
it's
of the
David
later
and Ahithophel, I think.
Yes, one of the I think one of the verses we have later might even be the one. It might be the psalm where we'll see. Well, if not, let's bring it up again. But yeah, this isn't the old covenant. This is not, the podcast is not giving you permission. We need a disclaimer guy. The podcast does not encourage you to stone people to death, because we don't. That's the old covenant. However, in your life, why did God do that? Because such individuals need to be separated from the congregation. They should not have an influence. And that's why he highlights, even if this is your friend of your own soul in another person, this is how close you are to this person. He says it doesn't make a difference. That person is a corrupter and should be separated. But in your life, yes, you're not going to stone somebody to death. But the point is, God takes it that seriously, that if there's someone in your life who is seeking to spiritually subvert you or corrupt you, you have to. That's not someone you can count as a friend. That's someone you have to put a firewall there, if you will.
Yeah. What a great lesson. And you know what? Maybe it would help to take a moment to because I know there's some younger members of our audience that would rightly wonder about the Old Testament and stoning and what that concept was. And I could probably find it if I search through my things here. But you sent me a text one time because I was putting together a sermon that was discussing why God would tell Israel to occasionally go, not even occasionally, go into a town and let none that breathe remain alive. And I think that's what I called the sermon. And you get to the story where Joshua's in charge and they're conquering the promised land, and they get to, is it Jericho? I think it is Jericho. So they conquer Jericho, but the next battle they lose. And Joshua is kind of apoplectic about it. It's like, what happened? And it turns out to be that, in fact, I'll probably remember his name. It'll come back to me. Somebody was opportunistic and took gold and some fabric and some things and had kept it, which they were not supposed to do. Everything was supposed to be destroyed and dedicated. And the end of the story, he and most of his family are stoned to death. And so it's such a harsh seeming story and lesson, but it kind of is rooted in what you were saying. Here was one person's action that caused a sin great enough that God did not back them in their next battle. And the only way to resolve that issue was to remove that person and their family from the influence on the nation. And I want to be careful how I phrase it. Like, you notice that didn't always happen, right? And Israel became ultimately corrupt. But God set the initial standard, which is, man, when you run into, if you have an individual within your community that's become corrupted and will eventually influence other people to follow that, you take extreme measures to remove them from the influence.
Yes.
And that's what the stoning was about, because it was communal as well.
Yeah.
Everybody's supposed to take up their hand and do it. I noticed that Israel didn't have another problem for like 80 years, and it seems like that everybody had to take place in stoning. Why can't I remember his name? I should look it up. Him and his family was not lost on everybody for quite a while because they had all witnessed.
Yeah, you need to know as people. You need the people of Israel needed to know
God
you cannot tolerate this. You cannot tolerate this in your community. It will destroy your community. Thinking of how dramatic that sounds, cutting someone off, really, it actually prompted me to think of Matthew chapter 5. And we tend to think of this as just, personal sin. However, at the same time, think of it more broadly. Jesus Christ says in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 29, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into Gehenna, fire, hell, but the flames that will devour the wicked. He says in the next verse, and if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it's more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hellfire, the lake of fire. Okay. So that said, we often think, well, yeah, sometimes we'll water that down by saying, oh, he's not saying really pluck out your eye or cut off your hand. Well, okay, yeah, in fact, but why? It is actually in the context of lust. And, lust, all those things, really, sin begins in the heart. Unless you're going to rip your heart out, guys who rip their eyes out or cut their hands off can still actually commit the sin in their heart. So on one hand, he's not necessarily being literal. And yet on the other hand, he is trying to make a point that yes, when it comes to separating yourself from sin, you need to be willing to make some very painful, difficult choices. And how many people, if they realize they need to not have a person as a friend, they'd almost rather cut their hand off. They'd rather do that because they really enjoy being with. But if they honestly look at their life and realize this person is actually a terrible influence on me, I keep making the wrong choices because this person is a source of that influence, then yes, God says that is not the person that you should have as a friend. You need to be willing to actually let that person go. And by the way, if you're listening, we have people of different ages. We're talking teens and young adults. We are not trying to say do this in some kind of vacuum. If you're not consulting with your parents about this, if your parents don't already have a good bead on all of your friends, you are making a mistake. They are your closest counselors. And these can be very difficult choices to make sometimes in terms of cutting off friends versus understanding who in my circle of friends seems more valuable and I should pursue more of a relationship. Please, please, please. I'm not going to bother to bring in disclaimer guide at this point. I'll just highlight. Please take advantage of your parents there. That's what they're for. And if your parents are ever expressing concern about a particular friend in your life, please take that seriously. It's not that they want you to live a life without friends, but they want you to live a godly life. And often what you need is that very perspective that can stand apart from you to see things more clearly.
Yeah. I was thinking about how at camp, sometimes there maybe would be trouble in a dorm, and occasionally it was solved by just removing one person from the process. We all want to be accepted by our peer group. Like, that does not even change when you're an adult. Like, you want your peers to feel like you're, I say good person, but like, you want your peers to have a good opinion of you. Certainly in your teens, you want that. And so to walk away one person, especially if they're maybe a little bit popular because they're a little bit, have a little bit of an edge to them.
Right.
But you and I have seen this over and over again from camp and in other areas of our life. There's a proverb that says, cast out the scoffer and the contentions will cease. And that's just a kind of some words there that maybe some younger people wouldn't be familiar with, but it just means somebody who's in there causing trouble and being rowdy and perhaps even drawing attention to themselves in an inappropriate way. Sometimes just removing them resolves everything. Like, you don't have to do anything else. One person can remove. And I'll bet there's some of our younger listeners out there who are already, maybe if they're honest with themselves in a way we are in a quiet, dark place by ourselves. Yeah, I know so-and-so isn't the best influence on me. I sometimes when I get in trouble, it's always with so-and-so kind of idea.
It's very much related to, it's kind of maybe a weird topic to think of, but speaking from a ministerial perspective, sometimes people wonder when someone is disfellowshipped, like, how can the church do that? How can they disfellowship someone? And yet it's happened time and time again in the past. I'm not saying every time, but there have been so many times when that painful moment comes where a minister has to make a call that he does not want to make. And yet multiple people in the congregation say afterwards, I can't believe how much more peaceful it is, after that decision was made. And sometimes you just have to. And so again, our focus today is on choosing your friends. Then by all means, someone who is really a corrupting influence on you, then absolutely not. You do not choose to develop a further relationship with that person. That is not someone you choose as a friend. You need someone who's going to be a positive influence.
Okay, let me correct my, it's a minor correction. So the individual I was thinking of who took things from Jericho was Achan. And so they get confronted about it. And what's interesting is he confesses to what the actual sin is, which is that he coveted these things. And so, a spirit or an attitude of covetousness, so the community is at risk of that spreading and more people. I mean, I've thought this through before. It's like, hey, maybe the next city we take down, there we can take an even bigger haul, and now I need to get another family in to help me, and we need more people because it's a bigger haul, and all of a sudden you kind of, or you have a crime family syndicate going on. But here's like the conclusion of it. I was off a little. Joshua said, "Why have you troubled us?" This is to Achan and his family. "The Lord will trouble you this day." So Israel stoned him with stones, and they burned them with fire after they had stoned them with stones. Because in when you get to Judges, it says that as long as Joshua was alive and the elders that were with him, they were all on point. And I honestly think that this, because it was sort of like, I think Judges actually says all the elders that had witnessed the Exodus and the conquering of the land, as long as they were alive and had the memory of it, that it impacted them, and the nation kind of stayed on course overall. But when they died and there was nobody left who had that experience, they become, generation by generation, became more and more corrupt. So it was hard for me not to conclude that this event here with Achan actually had a tremendous impact on the nation for about 100 years.
Wow. Well, you think it would. And that's exactly what God was trying to do then. He was trying to make an impression on the people. Don't make these choices. And you might even think, if you know anyone who has a friend that is clearly a bad influence on them and you just wish they get away from that guy, well, then don't be that guy. Don't be the person who's also in the same spot.
Look, hey, I can look back on myself, especially my 20s in particular. This is a real growing decade for me. There were times I was not a great friend. I wasn't a great friend for a variety of reasons, and I did like the attention of being kind of the rabble rouser a bit. And there was a point that I realized that that is not who I wanted to be, and corrected a lot of behavior. And actually, a lot of my life snapped into place, frankly, for the next 30 years when I made some decisions about that. But not even always. Well, I guess my point is, there's not a whole bunch of people out there who are bad friends, and I've always been a good friend. I've had to learn my lessons, and I've had to, frankly, abandon friends at times when I realized I just cannot be around that influence anymore.
Interesting.
I've talked about that before.
Okay, so we'll get into something kind of related here with the next one, and I do think this is the psalm that refers to
Psalm 41.
Was not of
Yep.
In Psalm 41 and verse 9. So talking more about the qualities of someone you want or don't want. Mr. Robinson alluded to that time when King David was betrayed by Ahithophel. And we do sing it in our hymnal. There's a song about that. 'Twas not a foe who did deride.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about how it was my friend. It was someone who was close to me, and he's singing about how it feels to have that kind of betrayal. And in many ways, Ahithophel, the tale of David and Ahithophel do mirror what happened with Jesus and Judas in a lot of different ways. But he describes him. I only grabbed one particular verse from that psalm, where he says in Psalm 41 and verse 9, King David writes, "Even my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." He writes just what betrayal he feels, and it kind of highlights that part of what's expected of a friend is someone who can be trustworthy, someone that you actually can put some trust in, who you can consider a confidant. Now, I'll hedge that in a certain way a little bit later. Let me not complicate it with the hedge right now. But if you know someone who's demonstrated they're not a trustworthy person, be careful. It's not just a matter of being trustworthy with you, but you don't see them behaving in a trustworthy manner in their other relationships. A person who's too willing to hide things from their parents, for instance, well, how do you know they're being upfront and trustworthy with you? In fact, if they weren't, wouldn't you be one of the last people to know? Yeah. So you want to look for people that if you're looking for real friends, you want to know it's people who are trustworthy.
And here's another pro tip on that. Not only did I learn this lesson, but I found it to be absolutely true. If you have a friend that to you is always trash talking literally everybody else, the probability that he's trash talking you behind your back to other friends is nearly 100%.
Wow, that good point. I've heard that made before. I don't think it was you. I think I heard it from someone else. If so, consider that two witnesses, whoever I heard, and then you. But absolutely, people, the idea that somehow they're revealing a character and how they think about other people, and how if that's somehow remarkably different than you think they think about you, don't do that.
Yeah.
So you want to know that if someone's going to be a friend, which also if you want to be a friend of someone, trustworthiness is vital. Now here's the caveat. I'll go ahead and say this so we can maybe launch into something else and maybe finish this in decent time. Sometimes people feel like, well, a friend is someone to confide in. That's certainly true. You need people you feel you can talk to without that need to be exposed to in some ways things that even you don't feel great about, and they're not going to somehow turn around and use that against you and betray confidences. And yet at the same time, and this kind of gets into maybe even the next point, maybe I think it's there. Yeah, you know what? Okay, we'll use this to bridge to the next one. But honestly, there are some times when something is shared with a friend in confidence and that friend needs to do something about it. If someone expresses concern about self-harm, for instance, or they're in a tragic circumstance, they're in a difficult circumstance, but don't tell anybody. That's a difficult spot to be in. But sometimes that person does need to act. Sometimes your love for that person, what you truly owe that person before God, might override. Now you can be upfront about that and say, well, no, let's go talk together, but it brings up actually the next point that I want to be able to make. And we can talk in detail about that. But in Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 6, which I don't know if you agree, Mr. Robinson, I think is it's been a favorite verse of the podcast. I think we've actually alluded to it more than once. But in Proverbs 27 and verse 6, it says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. And the fact is, you need someone when it comes to friends in your life. It can't be that they always agree with you. Yeah. They have to be able to disagree with you and be committed to what's right and wrong beyond what you think is right and wrong. Is that an exaggeration to say?
No. We don't have to go on about it because we have talked about it before, and it's not our key point. But 100%, like really, a truly good friend at some point is going to have a divergent opinion from you, or maybe even witness you doing something that's not the greatest, and they're the best people to give you that kind of feedback, something you don't really want to hear, and they can do it in a gentle way a lot of times.
Right.
But yes, that's the many things you and I have found in the Bible to be very true. That is a good one.
Well, I appreciate so many of our not just you, Mr. Robinson, but my wife, a good example in my life, even my sons. It's neat to be able to grow, as your children get older.
No, that's a good point.
I've had them tell me things I didn't really want to hear when they said it, but I'm so grateful, they were willing to say it.
I've had some good critiques from my daughters as well. I forgot about that. And they do it in such a respectful way that in no way can you be upset about it. And you're like, actually, that's kind of true.
Yeah. And so I say that because it's, when it comes to friendship, it is deep and it's profound. And so one of the wonderful things about friends is, as we go back to the previous point, the fact that they can be trustworthy, that you're talking to someone that you can trust. And it's I was thinking of a different passage, but it talks about brotherhood. The idea of that a friend is like a sibling kind of relationship. And I know not all of us have great sibling relationships out there, but there are those I really admire and I don't say covet, but where they've had great relationships with their siblings. And a friend is like that. It's like a brother that just brother from a different mother. And that trustworthy relationship that you have of being able to depend on each other, but also to depend on them to ignore what you want sometimes and do what they do believe is right by you. That's also an important aspect.
That reminds me of the principle, and you tell me if I'm stretching this a little too far, but one of the things, because there are people that absolutely come into the church that leave all their family behind, but God promises us that whatever family we've lost, you can find. I don't want to say replacement because that's not exactly the right words, but what's the phrasing, Mr. Smith, of if you've given up family, brother, mother, whatever,
that he will give you 100-fold, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And you do if you have to leave friends and family behind occasionally to respond to the truth, and you've come to the church, you still have the potential to develop relationships that will mimic I don't know if that's even the right word, but you can come in, you can have friendships that feels like brothers, or if you're women, sisters kind of thing. And maybe if you're younger, I've seen this before, congregations where there's some older, wiser women and they can function as a bit of a parental proxy amongst the men as well. You can see that same kind of thing. But the point is, there are other opportunities to have some of these relationships, even if they aren't blood relationships. You can still kind of get a facsimile of the family relationship.
Oh yeah, and that actually, I can use that to maybe branch into a proverb. Proverbs 17 and verse 17, in terms of what you're looking for in a friend. And Proverbs 17:17 says, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. And I love that, because first, instead of first, I'll go in reverse to build on what we're saying. The fact that in one verse it talks about friendship, friends and brothers. There's a reason for that, because a friend is like that brother you have that maybe you weren't born with, but you're leaning on like family, because they've become like family to you. But what it's talking about here, a friend loves at all times and a brother is born for adversity. Well, the second one helps to give context for the first. It's talking about hard times. It's not just talking about, a friend loves you when things are going great. Well, no, other verses in the Bible say, hey, as long as you got money, you got a lot of friends. It's not talking about that. It's talking about when there's difficult times. A brother is born for adversity, is born to be your companion at times when you need someone. And that familial bond means when no one else is going to be there, it seems, right, that person is there. But it's talking about that for friends as well. Real friends, profound friends, deep friends. When it says a friend loves at all time, first don't think of love as the emotion there. Too often we attach to these words the emotion that we associate in our modern day. But the Bible's far more practical minded when it talks about things like this. It's talking about actually serving, actually giving, actually being willing to be there, not just having a warm feeling in your heart. And when it says a friend loves at all times, that means real friends, they're not just acting like your friends when it's convenient. They're not just showing up when it's easy or when they get something out of it. But a real friend is the kind of person who is there even when you're in need, even when you're a person who frankly is someone want to get away from you while the getting is good. You're going through hard times. That's when you're looking for those in your life who truly could be real friends. It's a matter of looking at those who they're there kind of through thick and thin. If you're going, I used to, how do I put it? My mom, part of how my mom showed she loved us was she bought us stuff, me and my sister. And regrettably, we didn't have a lot of money. So therefore, she was probably borrowing on credit or this or that. But as a result, I had some things. If there was a game that I enjoyed, man, my mom was going to buy that game. And if there was some kind of books about kind of like cheat codes, I'm thinking more board games. But there's something about it, man, she was going to buy me that stuff. And consequently, I developed a few friends, kind of through another friend to other friends, and they'd come over to the house and we'd all kind of play. But at the same time, I started to recognize over time that several of those were really only invested in me because of those things. Mm-hmm. And if those things had disappeared, of the ones I'm thinking in mind, I'm not going to name names, even though none of them are in the church, but if all that were to disappear, there's only one of those guys that would still be there. I could have nothing to do. I could have no game, no money. My family gets kicked out, and now we're walking the streets looking for an apartment. And of all those guys when I was young, there'd have been that one guy that had been walking with me, trying to find a place. And of all those guys, hey, I'm not saying I wish them away. I'm glad they were in my life in some way. But in terms of a friend, yeah, that's one who was there, who was born for adversity like a brother, and that's one who would be loving at all times. And I appreciated him. It was a good friend.
No, that's nice. I've had, when I was much younger, had some friends like that you felt like. I learned that there were some friends that really weren't the best friends, and there were some friends that really, they probably would have stuck with you through anything. I might note Mark 10:29 and 30. If you want to look it up later, that was my poorly my attempt to not characterize is not the right word. Summarize the principle of, whoever's left house
Oh,
or
right.
brothers or sisters or mother, Christ says, who shall not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters. Anyway, if you want to read that, that's the point I was trying to make. If you don't mind, I know we're getting here into wrap up mode. Again, you've reminded me of David, because David, and so it's interesting. I was thinking about it as you were going through this. He first had this one experience before he had the other experience that you've already referenced. So a very young David, when he was suddenly thrust into the spotlight after killing Goliath, and now he's in the household of David. Well, he and David, Saul's oldest brother, trying to figure out what the age difference is between them, but I'd have to figure at least 10 years. But Saul's son Jonathan and David were besties, truly, and it even refers to their souls being knit together, and that and people take this, of course, too far in this day and age, but like that they had a relationship that was even deeper than a husband and a wife kind of thing, which is, you can sit and think about that for a while. What does that mean?
Yeah, the world tries to turn that into something perverted instead of hearkening back like to the verse it talked about, like a friend who feels like it's of your own soul.
Yes.
That's what it's talking about.
So having had a relation, and you know what, and Jonathan was a fantastic friend, because no exaggeration, his dad is literally trying to kill David, and so
Right.
Jonathan's looking out for him, trying to counsel his dad. No, he's not trying to hurt you. I forgot that Saul actually threw a spear at his own son Jonathan at one point, because he was vouching for him and helped save his life and helped get him out of the castle. And then, later they met up, and he was like, hey, just remember me. Jonathan knew David was going to become the king, which is pretty profound, because his dad was the king right now. And for him to kind of go against what his dad was doing, because he rightly recognized that his father's conduct was wrong, and he was blaming David in a way, but like, that is a really good friend to go against dad and family for what to be right and protect your friend. I mean, that's a deep. So then what we were talking about with Psalm 41:9, I just thought I might mention for younger listeners that may not be so familiar with that story, what that was referring to. But, David's referring to this friend that they spent time together, they ate bread together. Well, it was his friend Ahithophel, and what had happened was David later in his life, his own son Absalom rebels against him. They move into Jerusalem. David has to flee. You talk about finding out who your real friends are, and we're talking life and death.
Yeah.
David found out, and then he gets the very troubling news that Ahithophel is amongst the Absalom in Absalom's camp, and so here David, deep betrayal from a person that used to be a good friend of his, is now sided with his very son that seeks his life. And so that's what he was talking about, a recognition on David's part that, sorry that you made that decision, but we can't be friends anymore. When you extrapolate out the whole story.
No, yeah, I do. It's so interesting. There's so many dynamics there with Ahithophel. It's a fascinating story, and there's a part of me that can't wait to. I'm exaggerating a bit. I don't mean to, but when David is actually resurrected and we're all able to interact, I would love to hear him talk about that story, you know, and talk about what it was actually like, because we just get these little summaries here, but to have your friend and your counselor to just turn on you 100% to the point that they're seeking your life. I mean, what drama? The Bible has not been mined by the entertainment industry for the fullness of what it has to offer. And yet, part of me wishes they would, and part of me says, I'm so glad they don't. They would just make it terrible. It would just absolutely butcher it. I think we can jump to just kind of maybe a verse for a wrap-up verse in Proverbs 27. And Proverbs 27, which actually, in putting this together, I don't think I've ever really put together how many verses in Proverbs 27 alone are about friendship. It's almost like a little friendship chapter. It actually has several things to say. However, that said, in Proverbs 27 and verse 17, it says there, it's probably a verse many of you have heard before. If not, welcome to it. Proverbs 27, verse 17, as iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. And, I've always liked that picture. It's talking about two things of the same kind, iron, and it's not an iron and a stone. If you take your sword to a stone, you're going to irritate the stone and bend up your sword. It's not doing anything. But, it's not talking about sword against sword all the time. But still, use iron and iron files and other things to sharpen iron. And when you have two friends, if someone is truly a friend of yours, someone that you have allowed to be in that place where you would call a friend, well, the end result of real friendship that's healthy should be both of you growing better over time. It doesn't have to mean leaps and bounds like, oh, every day is a new revelation and every day is a super duper insight. No, relationships take time, but the end result, and you need to be able to look back over it, it should be both of you hopefully getting closer to God step by step. The effect on other relationships you have is a positive one. And I love that picture that God paints there of the idea of iron sharpening iron, this idea of working together in life, resulting in lives being better for both.
Yeah. When I think of people that have had like worldly success, but in an admirable way, and especially because I listen to a lot of podcasts. So with the long form podcast, you'll get into their background and they'll get into their story of how they got to where they were, how common it was for them to say, "Hey man, old Joe Johnson always helped me out, man. He always had a word of encouragement for me. He pushed me to be better. He set an example that made me want to try harder." Like that's a friend that truly, if an ideal friend really does push you a little here and there. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Occasionally they tell you a little something you don't want to hear, but if they do it in the right way and they're a good friend, hopefully you don't take it personally and you recognize that's something. I actually think of my marriage in this way a lot. I mean, when I know we're talking about friendships more broadly here, but in a marriage, I think I may have mentioned this on the podcast before. They found a lot of things that are very strong predictors of divorce. And one, as you might expect, is when there's too many negative interactions with your spouse. But the other predictor is too few. And that's also an indication that one of you is a pushover and there's just not contentious. There's not enough contentiousness, oddly, is the way to put it. But there's not enough negative interactions. And that also will predict divorce.
Interesting.
And so, as I've thought about it, I think, my wife was the catalyst for a number of things that I improved in, whether she was doing that intentionally or not. She just had a different approach to certain things. Like she's a woman. She was much more open, much more compassionate and open to other people's position and maybe why they were behaving in a certain way. And when I was much younger, I'm really mean more than 20, 25 years ago, I thought, come on. You should be agreeing with me. I'm your husband. And she was rightly taking their perspective, understanding where they were coming from. And I learned a lot from her in that way. But just in general, like a good spouse really is a really good friend, but also they kind of behave in that iron sharpens iron way a little bit by like, if nothing else, like motivating you want to be the best version of yourself that you can be, like ideally.
Yeah. I think of two contrasting examples as we wrap up. Of friend choice. You look at King Rehoboam in the past. Mm-hmm. He consulted with the elders of Israel once he had the kingdom from Solomon. What should he do? Elders gave him good advice. They turned to his friends.
Ones?
Yeah, the older elders, right? But then he turned to his friends, his age, cohorts, and they gave him terrible advice. And what was the result? I mean, the result was the splitting of a kingdom that remains split to this day.
Yeah.
It's prophesied to be reunited. That he surrounded himself with friends that frankly were not the kind of people he needed. Yep. On the other hand, this might seem like an odd contrast, but a contrast with Jesus Christ and his disciples. He told his disciples that last Passover evening, he says, "I no longer call you servants, I call you friends." Mm-hmm. He really was collecting a group that maybe they weren't perfect at the time, but he'd be spending eternity with one day. And with them, instead of something being split, it's something he could build something that would last eternally with. He spent all night praying before his Father about the selection of his disciples. It made a difference to him. Don't treat it lightly. Mr. Robinson's aphorism, I think aphorism would be the word. I think so. We'll see. I'll get judged on that if I'm wrong. But this idea that you're the average of the 5 people, closest to you like that, take that seriously. Counsel with your parents, counsel with others you trust, and don't take lightly the people that you spend your time with. if someone is a good friend, they're going to meet these kind of biblical descriptors of what it takes to be a good friend. And then in turn, yourself, if you want to be a good friend, well, you've seen some of the characteristics that need to apply to you too.
Smith and Robinson.